reality is that we are complex creatures and our desires are also complex. We often tell ourselves that we are rational creatures. This has become quite a popular idea, particularly since the age of enlightenment. Phrases like Descartes' famous "I think, therefore I am" have become lenses that we use to understand our humanity. Yet I would argue that there is a case for alternative motivations for our existence as humans. The father of psychoanalysis, Sigmund Freud, gave us a reality check when he exposed this lie that we are rational beings. He did this by reminding us that much of our lives are shaped by unconscious beliefs, thoughts, and feelings. As young, impressionable children, we learn how and what to repress in order to be welcomed into society. That includes many desires that we learn to repress. And if we listen to the great diversity of cultures that have existed on our planet, we can bear witness to the reality that what humans repress from the conscious mind varies largely based on what different cultures embrace as healthy and as normative. This is why desire can be such a frightening aspect of our humanity, because desire calls us to pay attention to our bodies. It calls us into the unconscious places of our psyche. It calls us to notice thoughts, wishes, hopes that we might have long hidden away in our unconsciousness. Desire can be vulnerable, and to seek the fulfillment of certain desires can lead to great despair and even anxiety. It's this reality that the philosopher James K.A. Smith reflects upon when he makes the case that humans are much more than thinking or believing beings. Instead, Smith explains that our humanity is marked by our capacity to desire. And thus he argues that the more true way to recognize our existence, truer than "I think, therefore I am," is "I love, therefore I am." Our first reading for today is from a love poem. We call this poem the Song of Songs or the Song of Solomon. It's the Song of Songs because it is the greatest of all songs. It's the highest song, the best song. It's like saying the Lord of Lords and the King of Kings. And yet, this is the only passage in the entire 3-year span of the lectionary readings. It's repeated in year A and year B. We're currently in year B of the lectionary. But it's the only time Song of Songs gets used in this passage alone. And though this means it will hardly be read in churches that follow the lectionary, I think that the fact that it's included is important because it reminds us that it's in our scriptures. Throughout history, there have been people who have questioned the inclusion of this love poem. What on earth is a love poem doing in sacred scriptures? After all, throughout the 8th chapter of the Song of Songs, there's no mention of God. Is God present in this poem at all? Yet there are many who have recognized the sacredness of this poem. There's 2 primary approaches people have used to do this. So first, some have read it entirely as an allegory. It's actually not about love between human beings at all. It's about God's love for Israel, if you're standing within Judaism, or within Christianity, the text was read as an allegory for Christ's love for the church. But within the last century, there's been a great deal of biblical scholarship that's emerged that took a different approach. They focused on the poem as one of desire between a woman and a man. And the scholars pointed out a few really important things. So first is that this poem is pretty radical because it is first of all included in the canon, but also it's the woman who has such a prominent voice in the poem. When you compare this to the other biblical texts, women get very little speaking. So not only does she have a voice, but the voice that she uses is to talk about sexual desire. So again, it's a little radical in its context. So let's talk about this woman for a moment. Well, at the beginning of the poem, she gives us this insight into who she is. She proclaims, "I am black and I am beautiful." Her self-description is probably an indicator for us that she's from the peasant class. And that means that she has to spend a lot of time laboring in the fields, which would have darkened her skin. So her skin becomes a reflection of her lower status, but it also is a place of judgment from society. People would have looked at her and said, oh, poor her. They would have pitied her. They would not have seen her as someone beautiful, as someone worthy of desire. Yet the woman in our poem doesn't just talk about her own self, she also speaks about her brothers a great deal. And this is probably because she's living at home still and culturally would have been under their care. And note that this implies that the couple who talk so much about their desire for each other are not married for large portions of this poem. And though her brothers seek to control her, in particular control her body and her sexuality, the woman persists in claiming agency over her own body. And she's claiming agency over her own sexuality in particular. This woman chooses her desire over and above the social conventions of her context. And because of that, throughout the poem, she faces negative consequences. You see, throughout the poem, desire emerges as a prominent theme, beckoning us to hear the voice of our own desires, coming over the mountains and calling us to be awakened to life with passion and zeal. Yet the poem never leads us directly to the explicit fulfillment of the woman and the man's desires, but instead it dances around this fulfillment, becoming an evasive dance, taunting us and evoking our own longings, perhaps even longings that go beyond the social conventions of our own times. So let's be clear here for a moment. We're not talking about the fulfillment of desires that cause harm to others. We're talking about the fulfillment of desires that bring about a more authentic connection with ourselves, with each other, and with creation. We're talking about desires that bring about pleasure, goodness, and beauty into the world. For the lovers in our story, their willingness to engage with their desire, even though they're going against the grain, is what gives birth to joy in their lives. Thus, we remember in the lover's gaze that life is more than duty. Yes, duty is necessary. We all have tasks and obligations that have consequences that need our attention. Yet duty cannot be all that there is to our life. And the lovers of our poem remind us of this reality today. Perhaps this is one of the reasons that this poem was chosen to be included in the canon. Perhaps those compiling the sacred text knew the slippery slope of religion that so often makes duty a central identity. But who wants duty without any joy? And listen, we are navigating a big process here. We are navigating the future of our church. We're navigating the future of our lives. We're navigating our society. And there will be plenty of duties to fulfill in all of those arenas. Those won't go away. But because there is duty to fulfill, I want us to be intentional about balancing that duty with joy. If we're going to strike the balance, we have to get clear on our desires. Sometimes those desires may surprise us. We may want things that we've been told we're not supposed to want or we're not allowed to want. And they may go against the grain of what we've been taught is good. And that can get really uncomfortable at times. Yet sometimes this is exactly what we need. We need a wake-up call, a call from our desires to help us recenter ourselves around what really matters. Because if we don't do that, then we just get caught in the web of joyless duty. So as we continue our journey here together, I invite you to pause, to check in with those desires, just like we started with. Make that a normal part of your life. Even if we cannot fulfill all of our desires, and no one can, acknowledged desire is more useful than repressed and forgotten desire. And we'll have a lot more energy and passion for what we need to do here as a community if it's connected to desire. So, my friends, my prayer for us is that we would hear the voice of desire calling us to arise. Arise today, because pleasure awaits us. Pleasure that we don't even yet know. Pray with me. Spirit, we do give thanks for the ways that you are moving in our lives. We give thanks for the many gifts of pleasure, that every good and perfect gift comes from you. So we pray that you would help us to lean into desire, to discern our desires, to discern our communal desires as well as our individual desires, and help us to seek the fulfillment of those and to bring more joy into the world. Amen.